Imagine that religious liberty is no longer protected in America. Christians are now among the persecuted. They must register their religion with the state. They can only leave their homes during certain hours of the day. They are shunned by society. No one will sell to them or buy from them. Above all, their legal rights are gone. They can be accused of any crime, and they will automatically be killed. What do? Do you deny Christ and live? Do you keep your head down and live your life as an underground Christian? Back by leaving your home during unauthorized times, registering under a different religion, doing business with non-Christians, and taking the government. What do? What does the Bible say you should do? Fortunately, the state of Christianity in America today isn't like this. Therefore, we should prepare ourselves by examining the biblical view regarding submission to authorities, even if the government has become unfair, unjust, ungodly. Despite the godlessness of many of our current leaders, American Christians should follow the biblical command to obey earthly governments and human authorities to the best of their ability in a fallen world, insofar as earthly governments don't require Christians to sin against the Lord. In my speech today, I will first establish the primary biblical passages about our obligation to submit to authority, as well as the historical context of these passages. I will then examine a variety of examples of biblical and unbiblical opposition to authorities. I will also address some opposing arguments. Finally, I will bring my conclusions into the present day by providing a few points of application. God has given us the Bible to direct our lives according to wise principles, but it doesn't give explicit directions for every government mandate in history and how Christians should react. So, we must therefore interpret the general principles to guide our actions and responses. One of the clearest passages in Scripture about our obligation to authorities is 1 Peter 2. Peter writes in verses 13 and 14, "Be subject, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors, as sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good." In verse 17, he continues with, "Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." He goes on to say, "Be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when mindful of one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly." These verses describe a biblical attitude towards the government. Peter says we should submit to authorities placed in this world by God himself. Many biblical scholars have discussed this passage and agree that Peter places an obligation on his readers to submit to the government. Arnold Monera, a professor at the Catholic University of St. Joseph in Macau, China, writes that only in the performance of good conduct and not violent resistance on the part of Christians can defamation by pagan neighbors, including civil officials, be lessened. In other words, good conduct will cause non-Christians to see the love and light of Christ in our lives, and in turn, think more highly of us. Monera shows that Peter calls Christians to reduce the persecution they face through their good works, their compassion, their uprightness. He doesn't ask for rebellion against all persecution. Like Peter, Paul gives a similar picture in the 13th chapter of Romans. Paul tells every person to be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. In this passage, Paul refutes the arguments that Christians don't have to obey the governments on earth. Rather, Paul exhorts his readers to submit to the government in love and humility and peacefulness. Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 provide some of the clearest representations of the biblical stance on human government. These passages emphasize the Christian duty to obey the governments of earth. Moreover, considering the historical context of their times, this submission would have appeared utterly foolish because of the severe consequences faced by these Christians. During the time both Peter and Paul wrote to the early church that they should submit to the government, Christians faced horrific persecutions from the Romans. Peter and Paul wrote during Nero's reign of terror, one of the first widespread, state-sponsored persecutions of the Christian church. Bible commentator Henry H. Haley says in AD 64, Nero needed a scapegoat to take the blame for the burning of Rome. So he had the Christians accused of arson and had them killed in cruel ways. The church at this time was in its infancy. Every day was a fight to honor God in a society designed to amplify the desires of their sinful hearts. Every day was a fight to turn away from the paganism of their childhoods and turn to Christ. But every day was also a fight to simply survive. James Thornton, an Eastern Orthodox priest and writer for the New American Magazine, describes the dangers faced by Christians. He explains that Nero also had them fastened to crosses, drenched in flammable liquid, and then set ablaze to illuminate a circus he staged in his own garden. The brutality faced by Christians was a systematic persecution and murder of anyone who claimed of Christ. Despite the danger, Christians during Nero's reign boldly faced death while honoring Christ. By modern American standards, they would have had every right to stand up for themselves and rebel against this injustice. Instead, they encouraged one another in the Lord to remain peaceful and above reproach. Even through these trials, Peter and Paul urged Christians to submit to the government. Before dealing with some historical examples of proper opposition to an unbiblical government, I need to define some of the key terms I'll be using, such as the various types of opposition. For this speech, I'll define the three primary levels as rebellion, defiance, and resistance. Rebellion is a violent action against authorities or the government. Examples include many of the revolutions and civil wars of history, such as the American Revolution or the English Civil War. Defiance, violent public disobedience or opposition to authorities or the government. Examples include nonviolent protests throughout history, such as the Montgomery bus boycott. Lastly, resistance is a nonviolent private action done to respect personal beliefs or matters of conscience. An example would be hiding underground Jews in Nazi Germany or escaped slaves in the pre-Civil War American South. Now let's look at some more historical examples. While we shouldn't resist the God-ordained authority of the civil government, this doesn't keep God's people from standing up and taking necessary action to preserve the lives of their neighbors. The actions of the Hebrew midwives in Exodus 1 demonstrate this principle. They were commanded by Pharaoh to kill every Hebrew boy that was born. The midwives refused, and then they lied about it. Despite the lie, the book of Exodus records that, quote, God dealt well with the midwives. Their loyalty and obedience they gave to God. To Pharaoh, they gave mockery and blatant falsehoods. God rewarded their courage. The midwives didn't take up arms against Pharaoh. They put their trust in God and quietly obeyed the Lord. I'd classify their actions in saving the baby boys as resistance, while their lies to Pharaoh would be a form of defiance. The Bible records a few instances in which God actually calls his people to rebellion. The Lord sent his angel to Gideon, commanding him to go and save Israel from the hand of Midian. The story of Gideon's victory over the Midianites shows one of the rare instances in which God actively calls his people to rebel against authority. These instances are the exception rather than the rule, but they have happened. Gideon took his stand violently and publicly. Because God commanded it, I would classify his fight against the Midianites as a rare example of justified rebellion. In these stories, God makes it clear that rare circumstances permit an active response against the government, despite a general rule of submission in the Bible. Throughout history, however, a number of people have advocated for a more active approach to opposing tyranny. Today, I will not be addressing philosophical arguments and those that don't claim to start from a biblical worldview. Some influential people in history have attempted to justify rebellion by misinterpreting biblical principles. Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, Common Sense, argued for the God-given right of the colonists to rebel against their English king. Referring to the power the king held over the American colonies, Paine argues that, quote, such a power could not be the gift of a wise people, neither can it be from God, end quote. Paine rests his argument on the theory that only just governments come from God and should therefore be obeyed. Furthermore, that the king's power over the colonies was never the design of heaven. He writes that, quote, even the distance at which the Almighty hath placed England and America is a strong and natural proof that the authority of the one over the other was never the design of heaven, end quote. Paine contradicts himself within this single sentence. First, he uses the Lord as an agent in history to say that a wise master has decreed where England and America should be on the earth. But then he denies the sovereignty of the Lord when he argues that it wasn't God's plan to allow England to rule over America. Paine's contradiction of his own statements reveals his poor theology of authority. And while some might argue that Paine's deism has little to do with true Christianity, the prevalence of his arguments in conservative circles has affected many Christians. Therefore, I will be addressing it from a biblical standpoint. The Bible clearly contradicts Paine's line of thinking in Paul's letter to the Roman Church. Paul explicitly states that there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. This statement disproves Paine's arguments. The Bible makes it very clear. All authority is from God. He alone dictates who sits on the throne or in the Oval Office. In contrast with Paine's unbiblical desire to rebel, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a pastor known for his opposition to Hitler's Nazi regime, remains a bold example for modern Christians. Bonhoeffer is primarily remembered for his role in several plots to assassinate Adolf Hitler, but this view of his life drastically oversimplifies a very complex man. Dietrich Bonhoeffer appreciated the peaceful measures of Mahatma Gandhi in India. He wanted to learn for himself this readiness to offer nonviolent resistance, and if necessary, to suffer for it. Until World War II began, Bonhoeffer had no plan to use violence or rebellion to overthrow the Nazi government. Instead, he used a variety of peaceful means to urge the German church to stand firm in their beliefs. Bonhoeffer penned a pamphlet campaign at the National Synod to be held in Wittenberg at the end of September 1933. At this point in time, the so-called German Christian movement had gained popular support. These churches and pastors supported Hitler, his ideology, and his laws in the name of bringing back a strong Christian presence among the German people. The German Christians openly praised Hitler and even supported his persecution of Jews, communists, homosexuals, Roma people, and other groups that were murdered by the Nazis. From the beginning, Bonhoeffer opposed this compromise to true Christianity and engaged in defiance and opposition to it. In his sermons, books, and pamphlets, he argued fiercely against the German Christians. However, he soon lost his license to preach and write in the State Church of Germany. Even when Bonhoeffer became involved in the plots to assassinate Hitler, his primary purpose was to protect the lives of the persecuted rather than make a political statement through rebellion. The pacifist pastor spent years of his life wrestling with the guilt he would take on when he supported the plots. However, he later wrote that discipleship of Jesus can also mean being guilty of a crime out of love of neighbor. In a fallen world, we may not always have a good option. Sometimes every single path before us leads to pain, to suffering, to death. Sometimes all we can do is love our God and love our neighbors. Bonhoeffer lived in a time of difficulty and trial. Yet he stood firm in his conviction that biblical love was the appropriate path. I would classify his actions mirror the story of the Hebrew midwives, who feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them. I would classify his later actions as a type of rebellion, though his intention to save the lives of the persecuted justifies this rebellion. He began his opposition as a pacifist, unwilling to take violent action in opposing authority. He ended his life as a would-be assassin, willing and ready to protect the lives of his persecuted, victimized neighbors at the cost of his comfort, his safety, and his life. In contrast to Bonhoeffer's pacifism and justified rebellion, certain portions of modern American Christianity have taken a violently nationalistic turn. The 2020 presidential election revealed no small connection between Christian nationalism and political violence. The election and its aftermath fed into the nationalist Christian rhetoric and symbolism visible during the January 6, 2021 riots and surrounding events. Christians participated in so-called Jericho marches in Washington, D.C. during December of 2020 and January of 2021. The protesters were blowing shofars, the ram's horn typically used in Jewish worship, to symbolize their connection to the marches around the city of Jericho in Joshua 6. As they marched on January 5th, 2021, they were, quote, holding signs emblazoned with President Trump's face, while once again blowing shofars and singing "How Great Is Our God," end quote. The protesters' use of Judeo-Christian symbols displayed their combination of religion and politics. The marchers prayed and swore they would not accept Biden as a president, despite biblical commands to obey the government. Christianity became a political tool, as songs and symbols were turned into marks of rebellion. In addition to the Jericho marches, numerous other groups pulled from their Christian nationalist origins in their protests. In December of 2020, a violent right-wing group called the Proud Boys prayed near the Washington Monument, comparing their sacrifice to Jesus' crucifixion. Their actions show their belief that they are truly honoring God's will with their protests. On January 6, 2021, the riots at the Capitol building were Christian nationalist symbols. The Capitol was invaded by, quote, men and women waving flags that read "An Appeal to Heaven" or "Proud American Christian." A self-proclaimed QAnon shaman prayed in the Senate chamber and, quote, thanked Jesus, end quote, for their success. Despite the professed Christianity of those in the riots, they entirely ignored the commands found in 1 Peter and Romans to submit to the government put in power by God himself. While some might argue that these violent rebels are not true Christians, they have publicly professed their religion and claim to be Christians. Therefore, we must address their actions from a biblical perspective. The Christian nationalist movement disguises itself with legitimate Christian principles, but the reality is that their idea of conservative America overrides even their dedication to the gospel. I recently had the opportunity to interview a local pastor in the Bible Presbyterian Church, Reverend Jason Weber. On the subject of Christian nationalism, he said, quote, every country has some moral order upon which it builds its laws. It is only common sense that we would desire that moral order to be the Christian one, as it is both true and good, end quote. As Christians, we believe that gospel-centered laws are better than laws that oppose the gospel. While this makes perfect sense, we cannot expect or force a secular nation to conform to our ideas of morality. To expect it would be folly and ignorance of the consequences of the fall, while to force it would be to deny freedom of conscience to non-believers. Christians should support biblical leaders. We should work to spread the gospel, and we should look forward to the return of Christ and his kingdom. However, the methods by which we advance this mission vary drastically among professing Christians, and not all of them are biblical. Our Christian duty is to make disciples through the power of the gospel and our witness as loving ambassadors of Christ. Our primary duty is to God. Jesus makes this very clear in his Sermon on the Mount. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. One might also say, you cannot serve God and politics. Anything that takes your eyes off the cross and brings them down to earthly concerns is an idol and an enemy to your faith. Jesus leaves no room for question. If your focus should not be on politics, however, then where should your focus be? What should you do? The answer is love. Love your God. Love your neighbors. Love your enemy. This biblical obligation to love one another extends to every single human on the earth. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, quote, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Our call to compassion includes even those we see as enemies, even those who persecute us, even those who hurt us. It includes those in the government. Paul and Silas demonstrated this principle during an imprisonment. In Acts 16, Paul and Silas prayed and sang while an earthquake destroyed the chains holding the two men captive. The jailer, convinced he would be held responsible for any missing prisoners, quote, drew his sword, end quote, and was on the verge of taking his own life. Yet the two missionaries had stayed in their cell instead of escaping. Paul stopped the jailer. The Philippian jailer was stunned by the submissiveness of the two missionaries, and he gave his life to Christ. Paul and Silas are a beautiful testimony to the power of humble submission to human government, even though the governments they encountered were abusive and ungodly. When we see the culture and government turning away from the Bible, our response should be love, not rebellion. We are not yet being persecuted to the level faced by Peter and Paul. The time may or may not come when Christians in America are killed for their faith. We don't know the future. We can't know the future. But we do know that our God reigns from heaven, and he has promised us our efforts to love those around us with our entire being. As long as the government isn't in direct opposition to the revealed will of God, we are obligated to obey human governments placed over us by the King of Kings. Peter and Paul submitted to the persecution of Nero. Follow their examples. Search the scriptures. Make sure your actions and your heart are in line with Christ's commandments.